If we have a free market where the government is not involved in this, then the price is going to be able to adjust, the quantities will be able to adjust, and we're going to try to go in and get ourselves back into equilibrium. But we know we are in a mixed market economy. And so we also know that the government gets involved in these market decisions when they don't believe the market will bring about the appropriate solution in the appropriate time frame. So what we said last time was if the government goes in and believes that this price in the market is too low, then the government is going to go in and install a price floor in this particular market. And again, if this helps, a floor is something you can't go below, right? So in this case, then, if the government believes that P naught is too low of a price, then the government will go in and install a price floor somewhere above that price. So what that means is nothing below the floor is legal. So thus the equilibrium price is in fact illegal. And so if that happens, that boots the price up to the price floor. And so if that's the going market price, this gives us the quantity that is being demanded at the price floor. This gives us the quantity being supplied at the price floor, shortage or surplus. Surplus, right? Yeah, so the quantity being supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So you have a surplus in this particular market. All right, so we went through farm price supports is one prime example of the price floor. And then one that we hear about all the time, actually, the minimum wage is another example of a government installed price floor. All right, so that's kind of what we went over last time. So if there are no questions at all about price floors and the logistics of price floors, let's go to the other side of this, where the government believes that the price is actually too high in the market. So let's go in. I'll tell you a prime example of this actually turned out back in the 1970s when you were looking for apartments in New York City. So you have the quantity of apartments, right, which would be down here. And then when you're going and you're talking about the price of an apartment, then you would be going in and you would be talking about the rent on the apartment. So since rent is a price, we can use that to go in and draw a supply and demand diagram. So we have a downward sloping demand curve for apartments. Remember, those are the apartments that renters want to rent. And then we have the upward sloping supply curve, which would be the building owners. So those are the ones that the owners are trying to rent out to people in the general populace. And thus, what ended up happening back in the 1970s, there was an equilibrium rent of $700 per month. And thus there was an equilibrium quantity of apartments as well. All right. Now, here's the problem. First of all, when you go in and you look at a rent of $700 per month, I want to put this in perspective. If you were to pay $700 a month for an apartment, what would you expect to get for $700 a month? A really fine apartment, right? It better have a fireplace and 3 bedrooms, right? A hot tub and everything else for $700 a month. That's a house payment. Keep this in mind. This was back in the 1970s, and this was nothing special. People from this period of time tell you that it was a 1-bedroom, no frills type of apartment. That's just the way the rents were back in the 1970s. They were very, very expensive. Well, the government of New York went in and started looking at this situation and said, well, look, if you take the average income of a New Yorker and then you go in and you take $700 right out the top for rent, let alone food and everything else that a person has to buy during the course of the month, we, the government, believe that $700 is way too expensive. So what the government of New York City did was install what is now called a price ceiling. A price ceiling is a legally established maximum price. Legally established maximum price. And this maximum price, this price ceiling, is there to protect demanders from these high prices. It's specifically there to protect demanders from high prices. So think about this for just a moment. If you, the government, believe that $700 a month is too high, then you're going to pass a law that says, all right, well, here's this price ceiling, and we're going to set this price ceiling, let's say at $550 per month. All right, and again, this is a law that has been passed, so I'm going to draw that solid line all the way across. All right, now think of it. If you say a price floor is something you can't go below, then a ceiling is something you can't go above. So thus, if you draw this, anything above the ceiling is in fact illegal. Now, if you want to go in and rent apartments for $400 a month, if you want to rent them for $1 a month, that's up to you. But you just cannot charge anything more than $550 per month. All right, which makes the equilibrium rent of $700 illegal. So this rent drops down to $550 a month, which is legal. And so if you follow this line across, this gives us the quantity supplied of apartments. If you follow this line across where it strikes the demand curve, that will give us the quantity demanded of apartments. So at the price ceiling of $550 per month, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So you have a shortage of apartments in New York City. Okay, does the analysis make sense? Is everybody all right with the idea of what we're looking at? All right, now again, I want you to always remember there's human behavior behind what is going on here. So I want to make sure everybody looks at this and you just don't do the mechanics, but you think to yourself, does this really make sense? Look at this for just a moment. If you ask yourself the question, when the rent went down to $550, does it make sense that the quantity demanded went up? And hopefully the answer is probably yes. Because if you are a renter of an apartment, you may look at this and say, well, you know what? I can't afford $700 per month. So I'm going to live away from the downtown area, out in the suburbs, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to commute back and forth to work and so on and so forth. But you know, if you go in and you drop that rent to $550 per month, there's a lot more people that can afford that. And it's better to live downtown, closer to work, closer to all the amenities and so on, so that people who are willing and able to go in and rent apartments increases. Okay, so I think that makes perfectly good sense. Now, a lot of people will look at the analysis and say, well, I can see from this that the quantity supplied will go down. But I have to ask the question, why doesn't that make sense? At first blush, why doesn't it make sense? Now you look at it and say, well, I can see that it's going to happen from the diagram, but why doesn't that make sense? So think about this from the apartment renter's point of the building owner's point of view. A lot of people interpret this as saying, all right, well, what's going to end up happening is if I have an apartment building that has whatever 1,000 units in it, and right now I'm renting out all 1,000 units for $700 per month. Everybody's happy. But now the government comes by and says, all right, you can only charge $550 per month rent. What some people interpret this as saying is, all right, well, I'm going to take the top 2 floors and not rent those apartments. So in my 1,000 unit building, I'm only going to rent 800 of those units, right? Because the rent went down. You see what I'm saying? Why doesn't that make sense? Well, if you're an apartment owner, why wouldn't you just want to rent all 1,000 units at the highest rent that you can get, even though it's lower than what it was, right? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. And that's because it doesn't make sense. That's not exactly what this is saying. What ended up happening here, and this did actually happen, but it was for a different reason. What the city of New York did not take into account was when you're going in and you're talking about apartments, the upkeep on these apartments is very, very expensive. If anybody's ever lived in an apartment, bless you, or you do go in and you rent an apartment, take yourself a knife sometime and go down in the corner and start scraping away the number of layers of paint, right, that are on that are on the walls. Because, you know, if somebody lives there a year or two, they have to put down new carpet, put up, fix the holes in the walls, repaint everything, and so on. And so, it's a very, very high cost kind of thing. Not to mention, if you're in New York, the property taxes are sky high, right, on these rentals. So what ended up happening was these building owners were just barely making a profit at $700 a month. When you drop the rent to $550, some of them couldn't even afford to pay the taxes on their buildings. So what some of them did, they actually went into the law and started reading the specifics of the law. And this one, which by the way, was called the New York Rent Controls of 1980. The New York Rent Controls of 1980. So they went in and they actually started to look at that law specifically. And this law only covered apartments specifically. It had nothing to do with condominiums. It had nothing to do with office space or any of that other stuff. It was specifically for apartments. So what these building owners said was, all right, here's what we're going to do. Generally, people do not sign leases over a year. Occasionally, you'll get somebody that does, but generally it's a 6 month to a year lease. So what they started doing was when everybody's leases came due, they started just non-renewing the leases. And within a year, they had the entire apartment building cleared out. They tear down a wall here, put up a wall over here, slap some paint on it and so on. And for a relatively small amount of money, they could change the apartment building into a condo, or they could change it into office space, right, whatnot, where they could get 10 times the amount of rent per square foot that they could by going in and renting them out as apartments. And so quite literally, you didn't have one or two apartments disappear. You had entire apartment complexes that disappeared. So the quantity supply of apartments did go down for that reason. So as it happens, there's a lot of people that want to come in and rent now. There are fewer apartments to rent, even than there was in equilibrium, and that went in and created a shortage in that particular market. Nonetheless, you still go in, and New York still has rent controls, and after this, some 23 other metropolitan areas in the United States actually went in and passed these sort of rent control ordinances. Okay, so anyway, there is an example of a price ceiling. It's an example of the government going in and trying at least to protect these demanders from these very high prices. All right, questions about the price ceiling? All right, just for the sake of argument, I do want you to understand that there are some markets out there that have both price floors and price ceilings on them at exactly the same time. And in fact, one of them we actually have in this particular area, and it's the monopoly of well, I'll be doggone, I just lost it. What's the gas company around here? Kansas Gas, duh. All right, it's Kansas Gas. It used to be, forget it, I don't want to go that far. Anyway, it's Kansas Gas Service. Because Kansas Gas Service is a monopoly in this area. Now, you go in and you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, Todd, I thought monopolies were illegal. Well, not necessarily. If you go in, Kansas Gas Service is what we call a natural monopoly. So what that means is if you're going to go in and you have a natural gas heater in your house, there's only one company that you can buy your natural gas from, and that's Kansas Gas Service. So what that means is that we need protection from those high prices. So if you go in and you have your downward sloping demand curve for natural gas and your upward sloping supply curve. So this, left to its own devices, would be the equilibrium price of gas. And this would be your equilibrium quantity of gasoline. Now, again, monopolies are profit motivated. They're going to try to go in and they're going to try to charge you the highest price that they can possibly get. So the government's going to step into this thing and say, oh, yeah, you're not going to price gouge. So we, the government, are going to go in and put in a price ceiling. Right? A price ceiling being a legally established maximum price. Now, I want you to note what looks weird about this over here and this one. Because they're both price ceilings, right? Okay, this one, I put in that price ceiling below the 750. This one, I put in the price ceiling above whatever that equilibrium price is. You say, all right, well, am I missing something? The answer is no. When you get in these analysis, draw these areas of yes and no. All right, because remember, a price ceiling is something you can't go above. So the government has said, we don't want you to charge any price. We will not allow you to charge any price above PC, right? Whatever that price happens to be. So we're going to go in and we're going to protect these demanders from these higher prices. But then the gas company, I guarantee you, is going to come back and say, well, wait a minute, though. Because we are a monopoly in the gas industry, we need to be ensured that we're going to make a profit. Because if we don't make a profit and we go out of business, who's going to give them their natural gas? And so the government says, hey, you know what? We agree with that. So the government is going to install a price floor in this market as well. Now, remember, a floor is something you can't go below. Right? So if those prices start to fall, they will only fall down to this point, in which case they will stop, and that will ensure that Kansas Gas Service is going to go in and make a profit on this gas of a particular amount. So what you notice is the part that is not part of this is this right here. That's your yes. So what this says is that, hey, the price of natural gas can fluctuate, but it's only going to fluctuate as high as the price ceiling and as low as the price floor. So as long as it stays in that particular area, it's no different than being in this room, right? We have a floor, can't go below it. We have a ceiling, we can't go above it, but we can do anything we want to, right, inside this particular space. And so these price floors and price ceilings are providing exactly the same idea. Okay, so there is one example of a natural monopoly and one where both price floors and price ceilings are used in a single market setting. Okay, questions? Okay, very good. So there's your price floors and your price ceilings. So if there are no questions then about that, I want to go ahead and just get started on the next section, going in and dealing with things other than price. Because I want you to notice, if you flip back through all the graphs that I have done so far, the only thing that has been changing in any of these markets is the price. So when I've gone in and I've drawn a downward sloping demand curve, it has not moved, has it? It stayed in exactly the same place. When I drew the upward sloping supply curve, that supply curve never moved. It stayed in the same place. So the only thing that has been changing is price. So now we're going to have to make the distinction between changes in quantity demanded versus changes in demand. Changes in quantity demanded versus changes in demand. So what I've been doing up until now is the left-hand side, changes in quantity demanded. So when you have those sorts of changes, what you will have is movement along a given demand curve due to a change in price. And that's the important part right here. It's due to a change in price. So what we have done so far is to simply go in and say, all right, look, I have a downward sloping demand curve. We've been marking it with a D. And my story has been the same the entire time. If I go in and I start at a price, let's call it P naught, as I draw this line over where it strikes the demand curve, that's going to give me my corresponding quantity demanded at that particular price, whatever number that is. So what we've been saying is, ceteris paribus, if the price of this product increases, then technically we move along the demand curve. And as we do, the quantity demanded declines. The quantity demanded goes down. So we move up and along the demand curve because the price is increasing. And thus quantity demanded declines. Okay, so I've been using that terminology all the way through, describing what's happening to quantity demanded and quantity supplied. But we know that there are things other than price that are going to go in and affect these market situations. So now we have to go in and we have to take these into account. So when I go in and I say there has been a change in demand, I mean there has been a shift of the entire demand curve due to something other than price. And again, here's the important part of this. It's not price that is doing the shifting. It is something other than price. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to get started on the mechanics of this today. But all the different things that will shift the demand curve, we're going to get started on Friday. And we're going to go through them very quickly. And then we're going to go through the supply shifters. And then we're going to put this model back together. So from now on, here's what you want to do with your graphs. Go in, you start exactly like you always do with quantity and price. And I want you to go in and draw yourself a downward sloping demand curve, only now get used to marking it as D0, D0. This is going to be no different than looking at the production possibilities frontier. We're going to see where it starts, and then we're going to track it to see where it finishes. So if I go in and make the statement that demand has increased. Demand has increased. So what that means is in your model, there has been a shift to the right of the entire demand curve. There has been a shift to the right of the entire demand curve. So in your model then, if I tell you that there's been an increase in demand, then you take your demand curve and you shift it parallel out into the right. And that's how you show an increase in demand. Okay? If, on the other hand, I tell you that demand has decreased, or there has been a decrease in demand, then what you want to do is shift your entire demand curve back into the left. So if you're starting at a demand curve of D0 and you have a decrease in demand, then that means that that entire demand curve is going to shift back and to the left. Let's say it shifts back to D2. All right, so does everybody see the difference in this? It is not a subtle distinction that we're talking about here. And in fact, when you go in, I think a lot of people tend to kind of wash this over. But if we're going to be talking the same language about demand and supply, and most of you I know are going to have to go on and take intermediate micro, for your degrees and so on, this is going to make a huge difference on how you draw your graphs and how you do your analysis. One is a change in price. The other one is literally shifting this demand curve in one direction or the other, which means the entire market structure is changing itself. Right? I had people come up, quite a few times and make the statement, well, price went up, so demand went down. Well, that's not a true statement, right? If your price went up and your demand went down, that means that demand curve shifted back into the left, right? And that's not what happens. When you say the price goes up, the market structure is still the same. The demand curve hasn't changed. Your quantity demanded, the amount that you're willing and able to buy, is going to decrease. So if you don't use your terminology correctly, you may be thinking one thing, you're conveying another, and we're going to be completely and utterly confused. Prime example of this, and I see this mistake being made a lot as well. Some people don't go in and think it's a big deal, but again, it's like this. If you're not using the correct terminology, you're using it wrong. Several years ago, I haven't stated it, I'm actually from the St. Louis area originally. And everybody has heard of the wolves being introduced back into the wild out in Yellowstone, Yosemite, right, and places like that. Well, it turns out that there are only two wolf breeding programs in the United States, and one of them happens to be in St. Louis, Missouri. It's run at the Tyson Research Center, part of the Missouri Department of Conservation. Every year, once a year, they open up the center for, the taxpayers to come in and see what their tax money is going to. A long time ago, my wife and I went to one of these programs. And guys, if you don't know anything about the Missouri Department of Conservation, they are very, very well funded. 30 years ago, they went in and put a 0.1% sales tax on everything in the state of Missouri, and all that money goes to the Conservation Department, and they use it for educational programs and things like that. So anyway, we went, to go see the baby wolves. And when we got there, I'm looking down because they always had booths and stuff set up, And I see at the end of this, the Missouri Department of Conservation has a display up, kind of at the end. And if you've ever seen anything that the Missouri Department of Conservation does, it's worth looking at. I mean, they do a really, really good job. So I told my wife, go on, and take a look at the wolves. I'll be there in just a moment. I want to see what's going on down here. As I walked closer to this display that they had, what I could tell was, it was about 2 tables wide, just about the tables that you're sitting at. But they had these 10-gallon glass aquariums, right, sitting on the table, and they were stacked. I remember them being stacked 3 high. They were either stacked 2 or 3 high. And then at the closer that I got, I started looking. I'm like, oh my God, they have all different kinds of snakes, right, in these aquariums. I don't know whether you guys like snakes or not. I mean, I'm not a fan. I don't kill them, but at the same time, we aren't bed buddies either. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you stay over there, I'll stay here, and we'll be just fine. And so as I'm walking up, there's a little boy. I would say he's probably 9 or 10 years old. He's standing there with his mother. So I walk up behind the kid, right? Because I figure if one of those snakes breaks out, the chances are they'll grab the kid first, and that'll give me time to get away. You know what I'm saying? You always take up a defensive position, right? And so I'm standing behind the kid just in case. And the mother is saying, oh, look, this is a black snake, and this one's a hognose snake, right? She's going down through all of them. And she gets to the copperhead, and she goes, oh, look at this one. This is a copperhead. It's a poisonous snake. Stay away from it. And the conservation agent, right, that was behind the display, in a fairly loud voice said, no. Copperheads are not poisonous snakes. He said, does anyone disagree? And I started to open my mouth, right, because I'm a country boy, and my dad always said that copperheads were poisonous snakes, right? Stay away from them. But I thought to myself, this guy has a point to make. And he said, no. In fact, he said, there's no such thing as a poisonous snake. And in fact, copperheads are not poisonous snakes. Poisonous means if it eats or if it bites you, that's wrong. If you eat it, you will get sick, right? That's what poisonous means. There is no snake in the world that you cannot eat that will make you sick, as long as you cook it right. Does anybody have snake, by the way? Tastes like chicken. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Which, tastes like rabbit, which tastes like chicken. So poisonous means if you eat it, it will make you sick. You can eat copperheads all day long. But if that copperhead bites you, you will get sick. What does that make a copperhead? Venomous. It makes a copperhead venomous. And so copperheads are not poisonous. Copperheads are venomous. And so when you go in, and a lot of people, semantics, right? No, they're 2 totally different things, right? One is you can't eat the snake or it will make you sick. The other is it bites you, it will make you sick. 2 completely different things. This is exactly what we're dealing with here. So when you go in and you say there has been a change in demand, we're talking about the shift of the entire market itself. When you say there's been a change in quantity demanded, it's simply people are buying more or less of the good, depending on what the price did. Okay, so there's the difference between changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded. Questions? All right, we are going to have a quiz at the very beginning of class on Friday, going in and talking about